Legend of Total War here, and today we're doing a tier list using Tier Maker. This is kind of a bonus tier list because you guys seem to be loving these, so I'm more than happy to pump out more of them. And we're going to be doing, instead of a unit roster tier list, we're going to be doing the faction tier list. So I'm going to cover every single playable faction playable in Warhammer 2 Mortal Empires and rate them on this list here. Now, before we get into the meat of that, I just want to do a little bit of a correction on yesterday's video, which was the Empire unit roster tier list, where I said that there wasn't currently a Steam sale on. At the time of recording that video, there wasn't a Steam sale on, but when I hit publish, there was actually a Steam sale going on. Now, you can see the date that I was actually recording that video. If you go and look down at the bottom right, it's available on actually all of the tier list videos, because I'm just recording my desktop here. It's just an internet browser. And see, that video, because there was a sponsor involved, it took a week to get approval before I can actually hit publish on it, and in the time between recording it and publishing it, a Steam sale had occurred. Now, that's just very unfortunate for Instant Gaming, because some great prices on Instant Gaming, but there's also a Steam sale going on, so maybe they missed out a little bit there. But do keep in mind, if you're watching this video after October 1st, after the Steam sale, then, go check out Instant Gaming if you want. The prices on Instant Gaming are pretty stable. What isn't stable is the stock. They do run out of stock all the time. I've seen Warhammer 1 stock run out constantly because it's super cheap. But if there's a Steam sale and that's what you prefer, by all means, go do that. Now, as a little bit of a compensation for yesterday, there's going to be a giveaway on Instant Gaming, thanks to them, where just click in the link in the description and enter your details to win a game key from Instant Gaming. Well, a chance to win it, I guess. But yeah, all I want is for you guys to get these games at a good price so that you can enjoy it as much as I have, that's all. And if you don't want to purchase Warhammer-related products, Instant Gaming is not just Total War. There's plenty of other games out there, so by all means, search for the best price. Alright, now let's talk about the stuff here. So, all of these factions will, of course, be rated on Legendary difficulty, very hard battle difficulty, no mods, based on campaign play. I'm not talking at all about multiplayer, and there's probably going to be big differences if that was the case. I'm sure multiplayer people will be like, well, but that certain faction is way stronger. Okay, it's just for campaign and just on Legendary difficulty. Another thing to point out is that because Legendary difficulty is so unbalanced for some factions, there are some factions in this game that are actually really powerful on normal difficulty and then just absolute garbage on higher difficulties. Notable example is Norsca. Norsca's really, really strong on normal difficulty, like one of the strongest races in the game, but when you bump it up to very hard or legendary, they immediately hit down the bottom, and it just simply because of supply lines. Because of the way that their economy works, supply lines hurts them more than the high elves, for example, so just keep that in mind. Alright, now as always, there's going to be timestamps in the timeline, so you can just check out whichever race that you want to, if you don't want to watch this from start to finish. Alright, let's start with the High Elves. Okay, so important thing to note is that there's like an overall strength of a race, right? So we'll use the High Elves as our first example. Like, the High Elves are probably like an S-tier race, one of the strongest races in the game. Super strong economy, super strong diplomacy, super strong military, just good in all areas, right? But there are standout factions within that race that are stronger than other factions within the race. So what we want to do is save the S-tier for the strongest factions within the strongest races. Otherwise, we'll just end up putting all of the High Elves and Dark Elves in S-tier. So what you're going to see is like a sort of like general gravitation towards a certain like pinpoint area. So all the High Elves will probably gravitate around this area here. Same thing with the Dark Elves, because they're the other super strong race. But we pick them like a dwarf factions, they'll probably gravitate more around here. So it's not like each strongest faction within a race is going to hit S tier, because the strongest faction of one race might be vastly stronger. In fact, the weakest faction of one race might be vastly stronger than the strongest faction of another race, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. Anyway, let's go on to the High Elves. So first thing I want to do when talking about any particular race is talk about the strongest race first, faction first, and then move on from there. So in terms of the strongest factions within the High Elves, I'm actually going to go with Nagaroth and Yvres. Now, another thing to point out as well is that I'm not going to include exploits in this. So the most notable example of that would actually be Bretonnia, and we'll cover that later. But the reason I'm mentioning it now is because Yvresse currently has a very, very powerful exploit where they can make practically unlimited amounts of money abusing their indoctrination mechanic, making them the richest faction in the game by like magnitudes upon magnitudes. Now, I'm not including that in their S tier ranking. Now, the reason why Nagarythe is getting the S tier ranking is because, for one thing, it's a high elf faction that's got a really good faction leader. I mean, all of the high elves have good faction leaders. The high elves are just good all around, right? But they also have Skaven mechanics in that they can ambush attack, which is so good, and also use the underway stance and jump around, making mountain terrain super useful for them. They're also able to globally recruit one turn faster than all their other high elf counterparts, and if you recruit Tyrion into your faction and level him up the right way, you can get an additional global recruitment time reduction. So most of Nagarythe units can actually be recruited in like just one turn. It's a super strong faction. The fact that most of Ulthuan is not suitable climate for them really doesn't hurt them that much because they are still a super rich faction, and I've conquered a good portion of the world really quickly with Nagarythe. Really, really strong faction. Now, Yvresse is getting it for a bit of a different reason. It all comes down to their faction mechanic as well, but they're kind of hurt a little bit by their start position. Now, the thing is, if you're a good player with the High Elves, you can handle the start position fairly easily because they're fragmented, right? You can conquer the Badlands and Ulthuan simultaneously, but what makes them super strong is the ability conferred by Athel Tamara. So they're the only ones that are able to recruit Mistwalkers, which are really good, especially Knights of Torgaval and Sentinels of Astaril. Nobody else can recruit them. And you're able to capture enemy lords, so lord sniping is easiest with Yvresse. And another thing that I think a lot of people don't think about is that when any other character, as in any character aside from Eltharion, reaches rank 15, they get to have a special trait, which gives them quite a significant buff, which no other faction is able to get. So there's a lot of really good stuff in Yvresse, making them one of the strongest factions in the game. Now, moving on to the A tiers within here, within the High Elves, we're going to go put the Etain and Avalorn in A tier. Etain's biggest strengths is that it starts off with Tyrion, so you don't have to try to confederate him because he's arguably one of the more difficult ones to confederate. Sometimes you can get lucky and get him early, but most of the time he's very difficult to confederate. And so if you've got him, it's very easy to confederate the rest of the High Elves. So uniting the whole High Elves is easiest with Tyrion. And also starting off with arguably the High Elves' richest city right off the bat is really useful. He also doesn't have any serious enemies right off the get-go, and it's just in a really comfy position to unite all of Ulthuan really quickly, really easily, and it just has a lot of really good mechanics. So just a really easy campaign. Now, Avalorn is in a similar position, really strong faction leader, got some good faction mechanics, but has to deal with Harganeth's Blood Voyage. It's the only faction that has to deal with it if you're playing as a player faction. Otherwise, any other faction that you play as, Harganeth will not use the Blood Voyage unless you're playing as Harganeth. But overall, very strong factions. Now, the B tiers within the High Elves are Order of Lawmaster and the Knights of Caledor. And it simply comes down to, they're very powerful factions, but their start positions let them down a lot. The start position of a High Elf faction is really important because it gives you early momentum. The fact that you start off with Ulthuan, or not in Ulthuan, is a big deal. Now, Knights of Caledor can get back to Ulthuan fairly quickly, but you still don't start off there. And it's the same sort of thing with the Order of Lawmasters. It just gives them a step below the others, but they're still very powerful factions. In fact, it's like even still borderline maybe. Yeah, no, I'm going to put them at B tier. People do send me a lot of disasters with these two. Okay, now we move on to Lizardmen. Okay, Lizardmen, not a particularly powerful race, at least in comparison to the High Elves. So, let's talk about the strongest races within the Lizardmen, which would be the Cult of Sotek. Cult of Sotek, I would put that at A tier, because its faction mechanic is extremely powerful. No exploits needed, the sacrifices for banners and followers and stuff like that. There's just a lot of powerful stuff in there. But it has a very difficult start. If it wasn't for their difficult start, I'd probably put them at S tier, because the Cult of Sotek, without using exploits or anything, can get global construction costs down to 0%. So that's really, really powerful. The next most powerful of the Lizardmen, I would say, would be Itza, simply because they have not amazing faction mechanics, but they have a super easy start position. Itza is an amazing city within Lustria, and they also start off with Kroak. And now every other faction can still get Kroak, but starting off with them just gives you a huge advantage right at the start. So I'm going to put Itza at A tier. Not because their faction mechanics are particularly good, but it's because their start position is just super easy. You just get up and running straight away, put the smack down on Pestilence, and then you're in a good position to keep going from there. Okay, then we've got Hexoatl. I'd probably still put... Ooh, not quite as easy as... I'd probably put him at B tier, yeah. His faction mechanics aren't that amazing. He actually has diplomatic penalties with all other factions in the game. Confederating other Lizardmen is not too difficult with him. He does start off with Hexoatl, which is good. But he's kind of surrounded by enemies, and he borders the Cult of Pleasure. So I'd say I'd put him at B tier. Lizardmen just aren't as strong as High Elves. Then we've got the Last Defenders. Now, here's the thing with them. They can be very powerful, but only in the super late campaign. Their start position is kind of really difficult to deal with because all the settlements are really spread out, and you have very powerful enemies to deal with. You've got Libaris fairly close by, Clan Moors. Grimgor is usually a problem very early on. Hag Grief, Clan Eshin. All of these are big problems, so I'd actually probably put it at C tier just because it takes such a long time for them to really get up and running, just because of the start position. It just takes such a long time to grow. It's very difficult to confederate Tlaqua a lot of the time, the guys that are right next to them. Tlaqua? Teotihuacan, sorry, not Tlaqua. They're quite close to them, but they just won't confederate, so sometimes people just go to war with them. So just not a really good start position. Alright, then we've got Tlaqua over here, and I'd actually put Tlaqua at B tier, because Tlaqua is a lot better now than it used to be because of Coatls. They've also got a right which allows them to just reset all of their movement, which is really, really good. Sort of like a precursor to Taurox's mechanic. And Tic-Tac-Toe is honestly not that bad. He's in a fairly rich, easy to dominate area, not full of super powerful enemies. I don't think that Tlaqua was a particularly difficult faction to play, so I'm going to put it under B tier. Similar sort of position to Mazdamundi. Then we've got Spirit of the Jungle, D tier. Rubbish. Rubbish, rubbish, rubbish. One of the most rubbish factions in the game. Okay, it's a Horde faction, so naturally it's bad. Well, not necessarily. I mean, Beastman kind of proved that Hordes can be good, but he did not get that right. So his vassal is, on the higher difficulties, actually one of the biggest problems that he has, because you could have like a military alliance with Reichland, for example, but your vassal gets bigger and bigger. Now the vassal doesn't do anything. It won't coordinate military alliances or diplomacy with other factions. So as it gets bigger, and of course it stays super weak, other factions will look at it, and Reichland will look at it and be like, I don't have any treaties with that, I'm going to declare war. And despite the fact that you have a military alliance with Reichland, it won't matter. It'll still say that they're reliable because the game doesn't give the same diplomatic penalties to you as it does to the AI, or vice versa. So your vassal is actually a huge problem, and you can never get rid of it. You can't like not have your vassal because it's your source of income. So it's just a really, really bad faction to play, in my opinion. Just really, truly awful. And then we got Pahuax over here. They're okay. I'd probably put them at B tier as well. Sort of not a particularly difficult start position, not particularly strong faction, just sort of middle of the wrong faction. It's fine, not too strong, not too weak. This would be here as well if it just wasn't for a start position. Alright, now we move on to the Dark Elves here. Now, Dark Elves are another sort of S tier race, one of the strongest races in the game. I personally think that the High Elves are stronger, purely because of diplomacy. The High Elves are able to make just about pretty much anyone they want to go to war with anyone else just with influence, whereas and also they're able to unite with each other very quickly, whereas the Dark Elves kind of have a tricky time doing that. Dark Elves just require big bribes to confederate sometimes, so that can be a bit of a setback, and they're also kind of isolated, and they're very badly hated. But their Black Arc mechanic is super powerful. Alright, so the strongest faction within the Dark Elves, I would say, is Lockhart's Fellheart's Camp, what's it called? The Blessed Dread. Very powerful, just because of the amount of Black Arcs that you can get. I would highly advise beelining straight for Ulthuan. A lot of major settlements in there that are also ports. so you can get yourself loads of Black Arcs right away. Very, very good campaign if you do that. I wouldn't stick around in Lustria. You can do that, but basically just beeline up the coast and go to Ulth 1. That's where it's at. Because Lustria has some port settlements, but not a ton. There's a lot of really powerful enemies there. So, very, very powerful faction. I would say that it's S tier. Very, very powerful. Naggarond as well. I would say it's an S tier faction. I would say that its overall power is probably a little bit less than Lokir's just because of the Black Arcs. But Malekith is able to get his shit together really, really quickly because he's got skills that reduce construction time, increase growth. He's got a really rich province right off the get-go. He doesn't have too many enemies that he's bordering. Some of his stuff on like the Chaos Waves border is a little bit iffy, but if you play your cards right, it's usually pretty good. But Naggarond can get their shit together really bloody quickly and become an absolute powerhouse. In most of your campaigns on Legendary difficulty, you'll probably see the AI Naggarond usually hit number 1. Fairly early on, at least until the Chaos Invasion comes down. That's their biggest problem, is dealing with the Northern Chaos Invasion. It sucks because it's difficult to prepare for it, because they can spawn and then attack a settlement pretty much straight away, unlike with the Eastern Old World Chaos Invasion. But if you play your cards right, by the time that they show up, you should be so much stronger than the Chaos Forces and should be able to take them out very easily. Alright, so those two get the S rank. Now, in terms of the A ranks, actually, let's go with the B ranks within the Dark Elves. I'm going to say that Harganeth is just not that good. The Blood Voyage mechanic is not great. It's okay. Harganeth is not that good of a city. Hellebrand is not that good of a Legendary Lord. You bought a Naggarond, so you kind of have to try to confederate him early on, which can be difficult. It's just not a really great campaign in my opinion. It's okay at best, but I'd say it's one of the weaker of the Dark Elves. Same sort of thing with Haggrief. There are some good bonuses and good strength within Haggrief, but starting off at the Dragon Isles really sucks. Abandoning that start position, going back to Haggrief can be a viable option, but then you lose your initial army. Holding on to both Haggrief and the Dragon Isles can be a massive pain. It's entirely up to you how you want to play it, but I would say that they're not one of the stronger factions. Constantly having to pay money to keep him from going full Sarkhan can be a bit of a problem. It's much better to just confederate Malus, and that way you've got full access to full Sarkhan all the time, because you really do want that extra public order as much as possible with Haggrief. So until you get 10 provinces and it's essentially free to do it, it's a bit of a slow campaign, at least as far as Dark Elves are concerned. I would say that Morathi would be an S tier faction if it wasn't for the fact of her chaos corruption, and also the fact that her start position surrounds her with people that just hate her guts like absolute crazy. So I'm going to put her as A tier faction, but she is very powerful. She's got the tools she needs to do it, but her campaign is definitely, for lack of a better word, is the ball ache. And then we've got Rakarth over here. I'm going to put Rakarth, the Thousand Moors, under A tier. He does not have a difficult campaign, but I would say that he's not the most amazing faction leader. His start position is not particularly rich. He's able to confederate Karen Carr pretty quickly. Same sort of thing with Lokir, but I would just say like A tier is pretty good. He just doesn't have a particularly interesting campaign. Nothing particularly difficult, no real difficult enemies, I'd say. And his faction mechanic is okay. Being able to pull monsters out of your ass is pretty good, but nothing too special. All right, now moving on to the Skaven. Now, I think a lot of people would kind of expect me to put Clan Skryre at S tier, but the strongest faction within the Skaven race is actually Clan Eshin, for two reasons. The first reason is the shadowy dealings. All of the shadowy dealings are awesome, but obviously the ability to delete a faction using Plunge into Anarchy, albeit you have to be at rank 40, which is not difficult to get to with Snickage. The ability to just wipe out an entire faction with the click of a button is so overpowered. Arguably the most overpowered mechanic in the game, and that belongs to Clan Eshin. You won't be able to do it very often, but you don't need to do it very often. It's just super powerful. And one of the great things about doing that is that when you delete a faction, all of their settlements just become generic rebel control. It doesn't bring back any factions that they have conquered, and all the settlements that they owned, the other AI factions take forever to bother trying to go after it, because they're more focused on the other settled factions, the major factions, I suppose. The other thing that makes Eshin so powerful is that they don't have to deal with any loyalty mechanics, which is one of the most annoying things to deal with, which luckily only the two very powerful races in the campaign have to deal with, the Dark Elves, and that's another reason why I think the Dark Elves aren't quite as good as the High Elves. But the Skaven, I'd say, have slightly higher loyalty issues than Dark Elves. But the fact that Clan Eshin doesn't have to deal with loyalty at all is really good, especially when you confederate Throt, because currently when you confederate Throt, when you're not playing as Throt, he has loyalty and can be killed, so that can be a bit of a pain. But if you confederate him as Clan Eshin, he doesn't have any loyalty problems. So I would say that this is the only of the... No, I'm going to put... I'm going to put Clan Skryre and Clan Moulder also as S-tier factions, but I really want to make a distinction that... that Clan Eshin is a cut above these two. But yeah, just talking about these two briefly. Clan Skryre, you know, unlimited ammunition Ratling guns. Come on. How could that not be S tier? But also, nukes. Now, you're not going to be using nukes every single battle because you can only get so many of them, but they're really good and useful in a pinch situation. Also, starting off with Skavenblight, one of the best cities in the game, period. I think it's the only city in the game now that actually has 12 settlements. Now, I actually told CA, or asked CA, if they could increase the settlement building slots to 13 slots. I feel like that makes a lot more sense, but they didn't do that. But whatever, it doesn't need it, but you know, it would be way more thematic if it had one extra build slot. Anyway, so the other one, Clan Moulder, another really good start position in a Hell Pit. You might think, oh, but it starts close to Norska. Norska's not a problem. Hell Pit's a really good city, and Throt's mechanics are incredibly powerful. Being able to turn your entire army into walking warp bombs is incredible. They can make melee infantry viable. They can make just about every unit in their roster viable to some degree using mutations. Very, very powerful mechanics. You can do a lot with Clan Moulder. Okay, so obviously the DLC factions would be super powerful with the Skaven. Skaven always get the best of all the gifts from CA. Now there's the other ones here. I'm gonna put Clan Moors and Clan Pestilence at A tier, and Clan Rictus at C tier. I don't think there's too much explanation needed for Clan Rictus, because it starts off close to the Dark Elves, it's Tretch Craventail, it's the Storm Vermin faction. It's still powerful, but it's the worst of the Skaven, by far. Clan Moors, it just doesn't have any special campaign mechanics. Not a particularly difficult start position, but you know, it doesn't have access to mutations, doesn't have access to nuclear weapons, and doesn't have access to like extreme assassination mechanics. So there's no way that it's going to get a cut above them. Anything that's good about Clan Moors can be confederated from Queek anyway, which he actually has some bad stuff in him as well. Because they have loyalty issues with Gracias, which is their best commanders, in my opinion. Clan Pestilence is stronger than Clan Moors, but their start position is more difficult because of Itza. So that's why I'm putting them at A tier, not S tier. Okay, now moving on to Vampire Coast. This is sort of a middle-of-the-rung race. I don't think that they're like A tier of a race, sort of like B tier. So, let's see. The strongest of their race, I would say, is definitely the Dreadfleet. I don't know if I would put them at A tier. I guess. Yeah, I'd put them at A tier, but only barely. Because the ability to have cheaper and quicker Necrofex Colossus is just really, really good. But I'd say that their world-conquering abilities is not very good. Their economy is not that great. Everybody hates them. They're just not world leaders, really. But the Dreadfleet is the strongest out of the Vampire Coast, for sure. Noctilus is an amazing legendary lord. Okay, the Awakened... or the Awakening, I'd put that as a B tier race. Same thing with the Drowned. Good spellcaster, legendary lords. There's not too much difference between any of the Vampire Coast. Like, if you want to play them optimally, you go straight for Necrofexes. They've all got access to shipbuilding. Aranessa is the only one that doesn't have spellcasting. The other three do. All their start positions aren't too difficult to deal with. I've had good strong starts with all three of them. So, I think these two belong in A tier. Sorry, B tier. I wouldn't put them any higher than that, just because their late campaign's kind of crap. And I don't think Pirate Coves are anywhere near as good as, say, Undercities. And they're also very expensive to build. Okay. Then we've got Sartosa here, which I would put it as C. Simply because their start position is okay, not amazing. but Aranessa just doesn't really cut it for me. Like, Sartosha Militia is just not very good, and Aranessa, just her not being a spellcaster and getting a sort of a crap mount with the Rotting Promethean, she just got the least gifts out of all the Vampire Coast ones, that's all. She kind of doesn't even really fit as a Vampire Coast Legendary Lord. I feel like she might fit more as a Norscan Legendary Lord, but I don't know. Things can be a bit weird with that. Anyway, that's the Vampire Coast. Let's move on to Tomb Kings. Alright, Tomb Kings have a similar sort of positioning where I'm putting Cetra at A tier, so Khemri is definitely the strongest because extra growth, extra public order, they just get their shit together quicker than all the other Tomb Kings. Starting off with Khemri, you do have a fairly annoying enemy in the Top Knots to deal with. That can be a bit frustrating at the start of the campaign, but if you get over that, it's pretty much smooth sailing for Khemri. Very strong, very fun faction. I'm not taking fun into consideration here. It's just purely about power, but I don't know. I just really enjoy playing Khemri. Now, the weakest of the Tomb Kings, I would say, is Khalida. I'm going to put her at C tier. Doesn't start off in a particularly good position. She's got a minor settlement to begin with. Libaros is not that special. She starts off sandwiched between Kroq-Gar, Queek, Grimgor, and Clan Eshin and Hagreef. Just not really a good place to be. So it's kind of difficult to get up and running with Libaros on Mortal Empires. So that's why I'm putting her at C tier. And also, she doesn't increase her hero capacities, whereas the other legendary lords of the Tomb Kings do. And your hero capacity is very important. And with the other two, I'd put them at B tier because they do have very difficult start positions. So it can be slow going. But they increase the number of Lich Priests that they get, and they're overall just more powerful than Libaros, but less powerful than Khemri. Alright, let's move on to Empire. So, there's 3 playable factions with the Empire. There's 2 Legendary Lords for Reikland. Where would we position the strongest of them? I would say that it's a tie between Reikland and the Golden Order, because while Golden Order is a little bit more powerful, like if I come into here and like have an actual quick look at it. Being suitable climate mountains is definitely a plus. Armor plus 10 for all units is good. Hero capacity plus 2 for battle wizards is good. Reduced upkeep cost of battle wizards is really good. This is all maybe better traits than Reikland's, especially if you're playing as Volkmar. His ones are not that good at all. But diplomatic relations with Empire is okay. Lord recruit ranks, it's good. I would say that he's just got an easier start position over the Golden Order, so I would put them at B tier. He's got kind of a difficult start position just at the very beginning. I don't think that the Empire is like a master of anything, but neither are they particularly weak in any degree. So they're sort of like just like perfect mid-ground faction. Now, in terms of the Hunts Marshal Expedition, powerful faction in a terrible start location. Starting in Lustria in the Temple of Kara, I think it is. Just not good, and also their faction mechanics sucks so much. It definitely weakens them. Well, it's good to get Imperial supply troops constantly, having to deal with that random bloody lizardman army that just pops up every couple of turns and just like possibly blows up one of your cities. Is just incredibly frustrating, and that never turns off. It's just a big handicap on their campaign. Yeah, they're still stronger than their counterpart, the Spirit of the Jungle, but Lustria is not a great place to be, and they also don't have access to the Imperial Authority mechanic, which could be a plus and a minus, but you actually have to go back and diplomatically confederate Karl Franz, because usually by the time you go do that, unless you do it right away, he's confederated most of the Empire, or died, to toss up. So I'd put him under C tier, yeah. Just not a really strong start, difficult campaign. Okay, then we're moving on to dwarves. Now, I would say that dwarves are actually one of the weaker races in the game. People who like dwarves are always putting my name in the book, and it gets a bit of a tiresome sort of joke. Oh, you're going in the book because you didn't make them all S tier, you know? But the thing is, dwarves do kind of suck, because their early game is super stupidly slow. They're one of the slowest early games in the game. They also very difficult to unite compared to other races of similar sort of power. Like if you're playing as Karaza Karak, you have to drag Clan Angren into a lot of wars before he's like, yeah, alright, I'll confederate. Also, the green tide that comes after all 3 of them, well, actually, less so for Ironbrow's expedition, but these 3 here have to deal with the green tide to an extreme degree. I'd actually say that of the Mortal Empires based ones, well, Game 1 factions, I suppose, that Karak Kedron probably has the easier start now, but is the weaker of the three. So, where to put them? That's the big thing here. I would say that in terms of faction power, there's very little difference between these three. I'm going to put Ironbrow. This is definitely the strongest one. I'm going to put it at B tier, right? And the other three at C tier. Because they've got difficult start positions. If you're really, really good with dwarves, you can get things going early. If you're really, really good with them. They also don't have any access to magic, but they have rune magic. Rune magic, it's nowhere near as good as even, like, the worst lore of magic, right? The only way to make rune magic super powerful is if you go spamming runesmiths, because they've all got separate cooldowns. But the cooldown individually on one runesmith is incredibly slow, and they just not that good. They do have some good units, and they're kind of sturdy. But when I think about these other races here, they've all got edges over these guys here. Yeah, so that's why I put them at C tier. They definitely don't belong in D tier, but I kind of feel bad whenever I put dwarves in here because I don't think they deserve it, but they just don't have that many redeeming qualities. They're just stupidly stubborn. That's all it really comes down to. Alright, now let's move on to Greenskins. Now, a little while ago, I probably would have put Greenskins as weaker than the Dwarves, but having played a few Greenskin campaigns fairly recently, Greenskins are stronger than Dwarves. For one thing, they've got magic, and second thing is that their early game is stupidly strong. Their late campaign sucks, right? Because their late campaign units are overly expensive, and they have way too many enemies, so doom stacking is not really a viable option for them. Well, not as viable as crap stacking. But since I've discovered crap stacking with Greenskins, man, their campaigns are just a breeze. Well, most of them. Okay, now, the strongest one is obviously Broken Axe. I'm going to put Broken Axe at A tier. Stupidly strong faction. The cooking mechanic, holy crap is it good. It's one of the only greenskins that can't be revived, so if you start off with them, you don't have to worry about that. You start off at Massive Orcals, a decent start position. I've seen some amazing things happen with Broken Axe. I don't think I'd put them at A tier. At S tier. I just don't feel like they're that strong. But A tier, I think, is a good solid place for them. The others, which is the weakest of them? I probably put Crooked Moon as the weakest. I think I put it at C tier. Its start position just isn't that good. It's okay if they're only able to recruit goblins, because goblins are kind of like the best units of the greenskins anyway. They do get cheap agent actions, but I think one of their biggest problems is just their start position, being in Karak Azgaraz, I think that's what it's called, and kind of needing to deal with Clan Angrid straight away can be a bit of a concern. So I'd say their problem is similar to the Hunts Marshal Expedition. They can get very strong, but their starting position is just a big hurdle to cross over, which if you do a good job of it, they can have a strong campaign, which is why I didn't put them at D tier. As for the other three, I think they all belong under B tier here. You can do a lot with them depending on how good you are. Wurzag is obviously the best of the faction leaders, Grimgor being the worst, but he's got the best starting settlement, and Azag just kind of doesn't have a very difficult start position, enemies that are already beset by other enemies, and you can beeline straight down for Grimgor, punch his ass and confederate him very quickly, if you want to do it that way. Savage Orcs are very much viable with the Bloody Hand, so I reckon they're good solid factions. No, not A tier, not C tier, but B tier. Okay, now vampire accounts. These ones here probably have the least amount of difference between their factions as any other race. I can't really see them being in different tiers. Now, since I'm not going to rate these based on exploits, I think it's important that I should rate them not necessarily based off skelly spamming, because not everybody is going to do that. Super strong magic faction, very, very rich if you know what you're doing, but their roster is very weak. If you're going to skelly spam, I'd put them at A tier, but I know most people probably aren't going to do that, so I'm going to put them all as B tier. But if I had to pick which one was the strongest, I'd go with the Von Karstein, simply because it's very easy to take Castle Drakenhof right away, make Manfred a vassal, and if you take Drakenhof as the Von Karsteins, you get a building there that's only available to them. which allows you to recruit vampires really early on, which the other two have to wait until tier 4. But vampire accounts are a solid faction. None of them belong in C tier. You know, Barrow Legion, being a little bit isolated from them, it's still not really an issue. They've got Strider. He doesn't suffer from, well, Heinrich doesn't suffer from non-vampiric territory attrition, and he's just got a lot of good things going for him. He's able to get Necromancer heroes stupidly cheap. They're all good in different ways, so I put them all at B tier. Alright, now we have this one here, the goddamn worst race in the game, Norsca. Now, it's obvious that the World Walkers is better than Wintertooth, but the thing that makes the World Walkers better than Wintertooth primarily is Wulfric the Wanderer. Wulfric the Wanderer, funnily enough, despite being in the worst race in the game, is one of the best faction leaders in the game because he does so much for his race. Primarily, the Sword of Torgold, giving +5 extra public order faction-wide, is really good for Norsca because they have public order issues in all of their outposts. Since Chaos Corruption is only like really easy to manage in actual Norsca, everywhere else it takes a while to get things up and running, and on legendary difficulty with the -8 public order penalty, it's really useful. Throg has almost no place in the in Norsca. I kind of feel like what CA should have done is actually should have made Throg a Warriors of Chaos legendary lord, and made Sigvold a Norscan lord, or even Aranessa. I just feel like Throg just doesn't fit in the faction at all. So both of these are going to get D tier. Even though this one here is stronger, there's still a D tier race. Now, the reason for this is because on legendary difficulty, the supply lines hurts them more than any other race in the game. So because they have so many enemies, they have very little ability to keep enemies destroyed, because they blow up a settlement and then the enemy just ruin dwells it, and they can't settle everywhere. They have fewer overall armies than the Warriors of Chaos, because at least the Warriors of Chaos don't have supply lines, right? They don't have to worry about that, so their armies will always cost more or less the same. As you continue to expand as Norsca, it gets more and more difficult because your armies get more and more expensive, and the amount that you make from raiding and plundering doesn't increase relative to that. And what ends up happening is that you're spending more money on your armies than you can possibly make, even by plundering like crazy, and they reach a point where they just can't go any further. So Norsca is an awful faction, primarily because of supply lines. If they were made immune from supply lines, which has happened before, like if you play on normal difficulty, these guys are actually S tier, right? If you play on normal difficulty, because 2% supply line penalty is nothing to them. That they have enough to compensate for it. But when you have 15%, they just can't compensate for it at all, and they get crippled by the late campaign. Trying to world conquest with them is an absolute pain in the ass on legendary difficulty. Not recommended at all. Okay, then we move on to Bretonnia. Now, this is one that I mentioned before about not including exploits into their strength ranking. If I was including exploits, the one I'm primarily talking about is the Free Knights exploit. That's where you get the Knights or Questing Vow twice on your legend, or not on your legend, on all of your lords, allowing them to recruit subsequent units free of upkeep. So, did I say free of upkeep? Anyway, free of upkeep. This is definitely an exploit. You've got to do a couple of steps in order for that to happen. It's not an intended mechanic, so that's one of the primary things that make Bretonnia super strong. Now, if you take that away, there's still a really strong faction, because unlike with the Norscans, these guys here, they are completely immune to supply lines. They're the only settled faction that doesn't have it, which means on legendary difficulty, having loads and loads of armies as Bretonnia is not a problem, because their upkeep cost doesn't expand the more troops that you have, unlike other factions. So they just have a linear progression with their upkeep. In fact, it actually goes down over time, because there are certain buildings and resources that you will get that reduces your global upkeep cost of certain units. So, for example, the beast buildings, exotic beasts, will lower your upkeep costs of all of your Hippogriff Knights, right? But slowly making them more and more cheaper. So, really, really solid faction, even without that. They've also got a really strong economy, whether you go with farming economy or industry. If you build the farm building and the bonus building, the windmill with it, you end up making 900 gold from a minor settlement. just really, really strong economy. Stronger even than the dwarves. They've got really good access to diplomacy. They're actually the easiest faction to unite, right? Because they just do it diplomatically really quickly. So playing as any of them, except for maybe the Chevaliers de Lyonesse, they can confederate each other even quicker than the High Elves can confederate, just because they do it diplomatically. Do it through the tech tree really easily. Okay, but which is the strongest one? I would say it would be Carcassonne. If we were using exploits, I'd put them at S tier, but without using exploits, I'm putting them at A tier. Now, the reason that I'm putting them so high is because they have the one thing that Bretonnia is weak with, casualty replenishment rate. It's the one thing that Bretonnia really sucks with. They don't have any lord traits. They don't have any like attachable heroes that can, or any technologies that can increase their replenishment rate. There are a couple of things that they can do. You can play as Carcassonne, getting plus 15% definitely helps. It's like a huge deal. Or playing as the other ones, you can actually defeat the Fey Enchantress to get 10% extra casualty replenishment rate. Or you can get a follower called a Mercenary, but in order to get that, you actually have to lose a battle, so it's a bit hard to get. Well, unless you suck, in which case you get loads of them. But there's not a lot that they can do to increase their casualty replenishment rate, which can be really problematic if you're ever going to invade inhospitable territory. Bretonnia really struggles with invading inhospitable territory. Now, luckily for them, most of the map is hospitable for them, because all of the old world pretty much is, and the desert is. You just got to watch out for Badlands and Norsca and Naggarond, pretty much. Everywhere else, they're pretty good with going over there to attack. But yeah, that 15% replenishment rate is why Carcassonne is so high up. The other three I would put at B tier. They're all good and bad in their own way. I would say that probably Bordelot is the weakest of them, but doesn't deserve to be C tier because there's still a strong faction. Repanse is really strong, but doesn't get the ability to confederate them quite as easily as the others. Leeuwin-Leoncoeur probably has one of the easiest starts and strongest armies to begin with in the campaign, but he also has to deal with Norsca very early on, so that's a bit of a downside for him. But all of them very strong. It's probably this. I would say it's the strongest old world race is Bretonnia. Very, very strong, primarily just because they don't have supply lines. If CA added a patch which introduced supply lines to them, they're done. I'd put them down to C tier. It just ruined them. But hopefully they don't do that. All right, now moving on to Wood Elves. All right, there's going to be a fairly big difference between the strongest and weakest Wood Elf here. I would say that as a race, Wood Elves are one of the weakest races in the game, but that's on average, right? Their strongest one is obviously the Heralds of Ariel, their DLC for DLC race. They're definitely an A tier faction, I would say. Very, very strong. The things that make the Wood Elves weak is supply lines. They suffer the similar problems as Norsca, but they don't suffer it quite as bad. Norsca doesn't make much money through taxes, whereas the Wood Elves, they make a lot more. Wood Elves don't reduce their upkeep cost quite as much as Norscans. It's easier for them to defend their settlements than Norsca. They've got better faction mechanics than Norsca, and the Forge of Daith for the Heralds of Ariel is really powerful. And main thing that makes them an A tier faction is actually originally one of their worst units, the Hawk Rider Doomstack, which isn't an exploit. It's cheese though. But Hawk Riders are incredibly powerful. It took a while for me to come around for them, but the Volley of Kurnos is what makes them an A tier faction, because it's a relatively cheap unit. They don't have to rely on Treeman spam, so they can actually have more armies than the other Wood Elf factions. The next strongest of them, I would say, would actually be Draika, and that's purely because of her ability to summon the dead, raise the dead mechanic, where she can just get out the woodland creatures in a pinch situation, summon them, use them in a battle, and then disband them or whatever. Very useful in an emergency. She's got some useful mechanics. She's got some extra techs that are very useful, but I wouldn't say any more powerful than any of these, nor weaker than these ones here. So I think B tier suits her. Now, Arguelon. Arguelon actually gets C tier because nothing special in terms of faction mechanics. Not the easiest start position. Not the worst. Durthu is okay for sure, but Durthu is the most confederatable out of all of the Wood Elves. Everybody can confederate Durthu, and Durthu can confederate everybody. So if you want Durthu, just play somebody else, I guess. So there's just not really anything particularly strong about Durthu, or as strong about Arguelon, I think. They sort of just bit basic. And when it comes down to Talcin, Talcin is a D-ranked faction because there is nothing good about them. Whereas at least Durthu has like bonuses to good units. Talcin has bonuses to bad units. They boost cavalry, and the Wild Hunt mechanic is garbage. Their officers mechanic is garbage. Everything about them is garbage. They're hated by everybody. I really hate Talcin in their current position. Just an absolutely awful race. I would say that their position is probably stronger than these three, but I would put them in a D tier, borderline C tier. I am not a fan of how weak Talcin is at the moment, but that might be a bit of personal bias. I just don't think they're strong, and this might contribute as to why I've said that the Wood Elves are kind of a weak race, because there's a big difference between their strongest faction and their weakest one. In fact, that's probably one of the biggest differences. Very strong faction, very weak faction. Well, actually, this one's probably the biggest difference. Alright, now let's move on to the Beastmen. Now, a few months ago, all of the Beastmen would have been put down here, right? But that's not the case anymore. With the Beastmen update, S tier for Taurox, primarily because I would say that it is actually the strongest faction in the game, the Slaughterhorn tribe, because it has the strongest start position out of any faction in the game. Even though their rampage mechanic has been nerfed a little bit, you could just plow through the entire planet with Taurox so quickly. Being able to just reset your movements and also having access to all of those items and all those heroes really early on, allowing you to smash early game armies with absolute ease really quickly, and getting, you know, all those rampage tokens going really quickly. Just such a powerful faction. While the Eshin mechanic to kill a faction is more powerful than anything that they've got, you're just not going to get that by turn 5. Whereas, you know, these guys here, you could destroy the entire world very quickly if you put your mind to it. So that's why they're getting the S tier there. As for the other 3 Beastmen, they're all good. I'm going to put them all at A tier. Yeah, so let's talk about these 3 here. They're all good and bad in different ways. And there's very little that's bad about them now. Their roster is kind of... They don't have, like, amazing units, but it's them faction mechanics, or their actual racial mechanics that actually make them super strong. The Herdstone mechanic is super good. Now, if your initial army gets wiped out, no big deal. Just come back, and even the buildings that you built, so just come back. They don't pay for any of their units. They don't have to pay for upkeep. They don't pay for recruitment. They have the Tomb King economy, except it's way better because they're able to get way more armies than the Tomb Kings way faster. In fact, their max limit for armies is 30, whereas the max limit for Tomb Kings is, I think, 21 on Mortal Empires. That's if you do everything. Now, I played a full map completion with the Tomb Kings, and I got my 21st army in like turn 200, whereas I didn't full map complete it, but I got to 30 armies with Khazrak by turn 80, and that was not really trying too hard. You could do it even quicker with the Slaughterhorn tribe. It just comes down to dread, how much you can accumulate quickly. And their new faction mechanics are just absolutely to die for, or to kill for, I suppose. Now, Khazrak starts off with his faction starts off with 15% extra ambush success chance. That's his big advantage. Malagor starts off with Malagor. That's his big advantage. Malagor being a 10 out of 10 legendary lord. And Morgr starts off with just a absolute kill zone. There's just so much to kill in Middenland and Nordland, so that's like his big advantage. The more you kill, the better. So that's the big advantages for them. Really strong factions. And then there's Warriors of Chaos, the biggest losers of Total Warhammer 2 so far, or 1. They just don't have anything going for them. They can get very powerful in the late campaign if you Shaggoth spam, I suppose. I'm not going to use the exploit where you can get like 1,000,000 gold by turn 2 as an example of them being strong. Like I said, no exploits, because it's not intended to do that. But they can be very strong. But I think I get more Warriors of Chaos Disasters relative to the amount of people play it than anyone else. Just not a strong faction. They can get wiped out very quickly. And they have a hard time wiping out enemy factions because they just don't have good faction mechanics. That's what it really comes down to. Bad faction mechanics. If they just got something that stopped Ruin Dwelling, they could very easily end up being an S tier race. But currently they're just not there, especially on Legendary difficulty. And then there's the tier list. Anyway, let me know in the comments below what you think of this. Don't forget to check out the giveaway that we're doing with Instant Gaming. All you gotta do is follow the link in the description. If you want to participate, obviously it's entirely up to you. Let me know what you think of this, and if you want me to do a racial tier list, cover the actual races, which there's 15 of them, which would be a much quicker video than this. But yeah, just let me know what you think, and that's the end of this one. Appreciate you guys, and I'll see you next time, fuckers. Bye.